May 8, 1945, 6:47 in the morning. Miriam Aldridge stood on the platform of Willowbrook Station with her hands buried deep in her father's old work coat. The air tasted of wet wood and machine oil. Steam hissed from the freight train's undercarriage, curling up into the gray Iowa sky like the breath of something dying. She could feel the cold metal of the photograph in her pocket worn smooth from being touched too many times. Nathaniel, her brother, 21 years old in the picture, grinning that crooked grin that had always made people smile back. 3 days after that photograph was taken, he'd shipped out to Normandy. 6 months later, a telegram arrived. Killed in action June 7th, 1944. No body recovered. Just gone. Their mother had died 2 weeks after that telegram. Heart attack, the doctor said. But Miriam knew the truth. You could die from grief. She'd watched it happen. Watched her mother fold in on herself, growing smaller each day until finally, her heart just stopped beating. Now Miriam was 18, an orphan in everything but name. Her father, Cornelius, had become a ghost too. Not dead, but not quite alive, just working. Dawn to dusk working the farm, never speaking, never resting, as if exhaustion was the only thing that kept the memories at bay. The train lurched. Metal screamed against metal. Inside the wooden carriages, 200 German soldiers waited. Prisoners of war. The enemy. Men who had killed American boys, men who might have killed Nate. All around the platform, townspeople had gathered. Some were curious. Others seethed with barely contained rage. Luther Brennan stood near the front, arms crossed tight over his chest. He'd been Nate's best friend since they were 6 years old. Now Luther was 23 and hollow-eyed, working his father's hardware store, moving through life like a man already dead. They shouldn't be here, Luther said to no one in particular. Should be rotting in a German prison or a grave. Miriam understood that feeling. God, how she understood it. The train doors slid open with a groan of old wood and rusted hinges. The first Germans climbed down onto American soil. They moved slowly, stiffly, like men who'd been cramped in small spaces for too long. They were thin, not starving but worn down, hollowed out. Their gray uniforms hung loose on narrow shoulders. They kept their eyes down, faces carefully blank, as if they could make themselves invisible through sheer force of will. Miriam had seen the newsreels, the propaganda posters plastered on every wall in Willowbrook. The Germans in those images were monsters, cruel, sneering, inhuman, twisted caricatures of evil. These men just looked tired and young and scared. That couldn't be right, could it? A sheriff's deputy walked down the line of prisoners, calling names from a clipboard, family names matched with farm names. The labor program had been running for months across Iowa. German and Italian prisoners sent to work American farms, filling the gaps left by boys who'd gone to war and never come home. The government called it practical, necessary. Miriam knew what it really was, putting wolves among the sheep. Aldridge, the deputy called. Cornelius Aldridge, 4 workers. Miriam's stomach twisted into a knot. Her father stepped forward from the crowd. Cornelius was 62. His back bent from 40 years of breaking ground. His hands gnarled as old tree roots. He moved like a man carrying a great weight. Since Nate died, since Mary died, Cornelius had spoken perhaps 100 words total. He just worked, ate when Miriam put food in front of him, slept when his body gave him no choice. Now he stood silent as 4 German soldiers were brought forward. The first was tall, maybe 30, with thinning blonde hair and pale blue eyes. Werner Vogel, he said in careful English, his accent thick. The second was younger, stocky, with dark hair and nervous hands. Helmut Klein. The third barely looked old enough to shave. His voice cracked when he spoke. Klaus Bauer. The fourth stepped forward last. He was 31, maybe 32. Not tall, but solid. Built like someone who'd worked with his hands his whole life. There was something in his face, lines around the eyes, a weathered quality that spoke of years spent outdoors. When he spoke, his English was better than the others, though still heavily accented. Friedrich Hartmann. People call me Fritz. Cornelius looked at them for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. Finally, he simply nodded and turned toward his truck. "Come on, then." That was all he said. "Come on, then." The four Germans followed him across the platform. Luther Brennan stepped directly into their path. For a moment, nobody moved. Miriam could see the tension in Luther's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands had curled into fists. "You should be dead," Luther said quietly. Each word precise, controlled. "All of you. You should be dead and buried in the ground." Fritz met his eyes, didn't look away, didn't flinch. "Many of us are," Fritz said simply. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't apologetic. It was just a statement of fact delivered in a flat tone, and somehow that made it worse, made it more real. Luther's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. The deputy stepped between them. "Move along, Brennan." Luther moved, but his eyes promised this wasn't finished. The Germans climbed into the back of Cornelius's truck. Miriam got into the passenger seat beside her father. Through the rear window, she could see them sitting on the truck bed, holding on to the sides as the engine coughed to life. The youngest one, Klaus, looked like he might vomit. The others just stared at nothing. The drive took 15 minutes through countryside that had once felt like home, but now felt like foreign territory. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the rattle of the old truck and the whisper of wind through new corn. Willowbrook disappeared behind them. The landscape opened up into fields that stretched to the horizon, corn pushing up through dark soil, wheat turning from green to gold. Everything looked peaceful, abundant, safe. Miriam wondered what it looked like to men who'd spent years at war, men whose own country was being bombed to rubble while they rode through Iowa farmland in the back of a pickup truck. The Aldridge farm appeared ahead, 100 acres of good land, a small dairy herd, a barn that needed paint, a white farmhouse built in 1889 by Cornelius's grandfather. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Cornelius brought the truck to a stop in the yard. The Germans climbed down, stood waiting for instructions. They had no idea what was expected of them, had probably imagined American prisons would be like German ones, barbed wire guard towers. Brutality. Instead, they got a quiet farm, a barn with hay in the loft, fields that needed tending. Cornelius pointed toward the barn without speaking. "Sleep there. Hay's clean. Blankets in the box by the door." He pointed toward the north field. "Plowing starts tomorrow, dawn. I'll show you the equipment in the morning." That was it. No rules, no speeches, just sleep here, work starts tomorrow. The Germans glanced at each other uncertainly. Fritz nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. Cornelius didn't respond. He turned and walked toward the house. Miriam followed, but at the porch steps she paused, looked back. The four prisoners were walking toward the barn. Fritz led the way. At the door, he stopped. His hand went to his jacket pocket, touched something there, his fingers lingering for just a moment before he let his hand drop and went inside. Miriam wondered what he was carrying. What object a German soldier would touch like that? Like a prayer, like a talisman against the dark. She didn't know it then, but that gesture would haunt her, would keep her awake nights wondering. Inside the house, silence pressed down like a physical weight. Cornelius sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold in his hands. Miriam heated soup on the stove, moving mechanically through the familiar motions. Neither of them spoke about the four men in the barn. What was there to say? That night, Miriam lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Through her window, she could see the barn dark against the darker sky. A faint light showed through cracks in the wood where someone had lit a lantern. She imagined them in there, sitting on hay bales, speaking German in low voices, thinking about homes they hadn't seen in years, about families who might be dead. No. She stopped that thought immediately, crushed it. They weren't people, not really. They were the enemy. They'd worn the uniform. They'd followed orders. They'd killed American boys. Maybe not personally, maybe not with their own hands. But they'd been part of it, part of the machine that took Nate from her. She couldn't think of them as human. If she did, she'd have to face something she wasn't ready to face, the possibility that the world wasn't as simple as she needed it to be. That good and evil weren't as clear-cut as the propaganda posters made them seem. Better to keep them as monsters. Easier that way. The next morning came cold and clear. Miriam woke before dawn to the sound of her father's boots on the wooden porch. When she looked out the window, the 4 Germans were already standing in the yard, waiting in a neat line. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen, made coffee, fried eggs, sliced bread, breakfast for 2, just her and Cornelius. The Germans would have to manage on their own, but when she carried the food to the table, Cornelius was looking out the window at the 4 men standing in the cold morning air. He didn't say anything, just looked, and Miriam knew what he was thinking because she was thinking it too. They were here. They were going to work. They needed to eat. She went back to the stove without a word, fried more eggs, sliced more bread, made it mechanically, trying not to think about what it meant. When it was ready, she put it on a tray and carried it outside. The Germans turned as she approached. She set the tray down on the porch railing and stepped back quickly. Didn't meet their eyes, didn't speak. Fritz stepped forward. "Thank you, miss." She didn't answer, just turned and went back inside, closed the door firmly behind her. Through the window, she watched them divide the food. Fritz took the smallest portion, made sure the others ate first. When Klaus reached for a second piece of bread, Fritz nudged it toward him without taking any himself. That small gesture of kindness bothered Miriam more than she wanted to admit. Monsters weren't kind to each other. Monsters took. They destroyed. They were selfish. That's what she'd been taught, what she'd believed for 2 years. So what did it mean that these men, these enemies, were taking care of each other? After breakfast, Cornelius led them to the north field. Miriam followed at a distance, telling herself she was just keeping watch, making sure they didn't try anything. But really, she was curious, needed to see if they could actually work. Cornelius showed them the plow, the harness for the draft horses. Old equipment, simple, but it needed to be handled properly or you could ruin a whole field. Fritz stepped forward immediately. He ran his hand along the plow blade, checked the fittings, adjusted a strap on the harness. The movements were practiced, confident. When he looked up at Cornelius, there was recognition in his eyes. "My father had one like this," Fritz said carefully. "In Bavaria. I grew up farming. I know this work." He demonstrated for the others how to guide the horses, how to keep the furrows straight, how to read the soil and adjust the depth. The other 3 watched like students, city boys who'd probably never touched farm equipment before the war. But Fritz knew. He moved with the ease of someone who'd done this work since childhood. By mid-morning, they'd turned 3 acres. The furrows ran straight and true. Cornelius watched from the fence line. His expression was unreadable, but Miriam saw him nod once. A small acknowledgement. They could work. That was something. At noon, Miriam brought lunch to the field. Bread, cheese, apples, a jar of water. She set it on a fence post and started to walk away immediately. "Miss Aldridge?" She stopped, turned slowly. Fritz was standing 10 feet away, cap in his hands. The sun was behind him and she couldn't see his face clearly, but she could see his posture, careful, respectful, like a man walking on dangerous ground. "Thank you for the food," he said quietly. "We know this is not easy, having us here. We are grateful." Miriam's throat tightened. She wanted to say something cutting, something cruel, remind him he was the enemy, that he had no right to speak to her like they were equals. But the words wouldn't come, because he was right. It wasn't easy, and him acknowledging that somehow made it worse, made him seem more human. She turned and walked away without responding. That afternoon, while the Germans worked the field, Miriam went into the parlor. The room her mother had kept pristine, the room they barely used anymore because it hurt too much. On the mantelpiece sat a photograph in a carved wooden frame. The Aldridge family, taken in 1938 before the world fell apart. Cornelius and Mary, Miriam at 11 gap-toothed and grinning, and Nate at 14 wearing his first suit jacket, that crooked smile on his face. She picked up the photograph, studied her brother's face, tried to remember his voice, his laugh, the way he used to ruffle her hair and call her squirt. The memories were already fading. 2 years wasn't that long, but grief had a way of making everything distant, blurry, like looking at the past through water. She set the photograph back carefully, exactly where it had always been. That evening, after the Germans had put away the equipment and washed at the pump, they disappeared into the barn. Miriam watched from the kitchen window as lamplight flickered to life inside. She should have left them alone, should have minded her own business. Instead, she found herself walking across the darkening yard, moving quietly, staying in the shadows. The barn door was open just a crack. She could hear voices inside, German words she couldn't understand. She moved closer, peered through the gap. Werner was writing a letter by lamplight, his hand moving slowly across the page. Helmut was mending a tear in his jacket with careful stitches. Klaus sat with his back against a post, eyes closed, maybe sleeping, or maybe just trying to escape into his own head. And Fritz. Fritz sat slightly apart from the others. He had something in his hands, a piece of paper folded many times until it was small enough to fit in a pocket. He unfolded it with the kind of care you'd give something precious, something irreplaceable. Miriam couldn't see what was on the paper from where she stood, but she could see Fritz's face as he looked at it, could see the way his expression changed. Grief, longing, pain so deep it seemed to radiate from him like heat. He sat like that for several minutes, just looking. His lips moved silently, like he was speaking to whoever was in that photograph, or maybe praying, maybe both. Then he folded it again, precisely, carefully, slipped it back into his pocket, the same pocket he touched every morning when he woke, every night before he slept. Miriam backed away, returned to the house, lay in bed in the dark, staring at nothing. What was he carrying? What face was on that paper? What loss? She told herself she didn't care, told herself it didn't matter, but the question burrowed into her mind and wouldn't let go, because whatever Fritz Hartmann carried in his pocket, it mattered to him. Mattered enough to look at every single night, to fold with such care, to keep close to his heart. And if he could feel that depth of emotion, if he could grieve like that, then he wasn't just a faceless enemy, wasn't just a Nazi monster from a propaganda poster. He was a man, a human being who'd lost something, who remembered, who carried his dead with him. Miriam didn't want to think of him that way. It would be so much easier if he stayed a monster, simple, clear, easy to hate without complication or doubt. But nothing about this was easy, and she suspected nothing ever would be again. 3 days passed. The routine established itself like a groove worn into wood. The Germans rose before dawn, worked until dark, ate the food Miriam brought them without complaint, slept in the barn. On the 4th night, Miriam woke to screaming. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, trying to place the sound. It came from the barn. Words in German, desperate and terrified, someone having a nightmare. She went to the window, saw a light flare to life in the barn, heard voices, the other prisoners trying to calm whoever was screaming. The noise stopped. The light stayed on. Miriam lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. She kept thinking about that scream, the raw terror in it, the sound of a man reliving something terrible. What she didn't know was that in the main house, Cornelius was also awake, sitting in his chair by the cold fireplace, because he'd had the same nightmare he'd been having for 11 months. The nightmare where he saw Nate dying on a beach in France. Saw his son calling for him while bullets tore through the air. Saw everything he couldn't save, couldn't fix, couldn't undo. 2 men, 2 nightmares, 2 different sides of the same terrible war, both haunted by Normandy. If they'd talked about it, if they'd shared those nightmares, they might have understood each other sooner. Might have realized they were both carrying the same weight. But they didn't talk. Not yet. So they suffered alone, in separate buildings, separated by 50 yards and an ocean of grief. The next morning, Fritz looked haggard. His hands shook slightly as he took his breakfast. The others were quiet, subdued. Something had happened in the night, something more than just a bad dream. Miriam wanted to ask, wanted to know what he dreamed about that made him scream like that, but she didn't. Because asking would make it real, would make him human, would make everything complicated. So she said nothing, just brought the food, watched the meat, went back to the house. On Sunday, the Germans were given the day to rest. Cornelius and Miriam went to church in town. Or rather, Cornelius went. Miriam had stopped attending after her mother's funeral. Couldn't sit in that building and listen to talk about God's plan in heaven and peace when her whole world had been torn apart. But Cornelius still went. Sat in the same pew he'd sat in for 50 years. Listened to Reverend Morrison preach about faith and endurance and the war finally ending. When they returned home, Miriam saw something that stopped her cold. The parlor door was open, the door they always kept closed. And inside, standing in front of the mantelpiece, was Fritz. He was looking at the family photograph, at the Aldridge family from 1938, at Nate in his suit jacket with that crooked smile. Fritz didn't hear them come in. He was too focused on the photograph, and as Miriam watched frozen in the doorway, Fritz's hand went to his jacket pocket, touched it. His face went pale. He saw Nate's uniform in the picture, saw something that made his whole body go rigid. "What are you doing in here?" Miriam's voice came out sharp, accusing. Fritz spun around. Guilt and something else, something that looked like horror, flashed across his face. "I am sorry," he said quickly. "The door was open. I thought maybe to find broom to sweep the barn. I see photograph. I should not have looked. I am sorry." He moved toward the door. Miriam stepped aside to let him pass, but not before she saw his face up close. Saw that he looked shaken, deeply disturbed by something. After he left, she went to the mantelpiece, looked at the photograph, tried to see what he'd seen. Nate in his army uniform, the insignia on his shoulder, 2nd Infantry Division. She didn't understand why that would matter. Didn't know that Fritz had just recognized the same insignia he'd fought against at Normandy. The same division that had stormed his bunker on June 7th, 1944. Didn't know that Fritz now suspected, almost certainly knew, that he might have killed the boy in this photograph. Might have killed this farmer's son. Might be living in the home of the man whose child he'd murdered. All she knew was that Fritz had looked at Nate's picture and turned pale as death. That night, the screaming from the barn came again. Louder this time, more desperate. Fritz's voice crying out in German. Words Miriam couldn't understand, but she didn't need to understand the language to hear the guilt, the agony, the grief. In the morning, Fritz's eyes were hollow. He moved through the work like a man already dead. Barely spoke, barely ate. And Miriam watched him, wondering what demons were eating him alive. Wondering why, despite everything, she cared. 3 weeks became 4. 4 became 6. The rhythm of farm work swallowed them all. 5:30 every morning, the 4 Germans emerged from the barn. 7 every evening they returned. Between those hours there was work, endless necessary work that demanded strong backs and steady hands, but asked no questions about the past. Plowing gave way to planting. Planting gave way to tending. The corn pushed up through dark Iowa soil, green and determined. The wheat shifted from emerald to gold under the lengthening June sun. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sharp edges of hatred began to dull. Miriam fell into the pattern without meaning to. She made breakfast, carried it to the porch. The Germans ate in silence. They worked. At noon, she brought lunch to wherever they were in the fields, set it down, walked away. Except she stopped walking away quite so quickly. At first, she told herself she was just making sure they weren't wasting food, making sure they were working properly. But that was a lie, and she knew it. The truth was simpler and more complicated. She was curious. She'd started keeping a German-English dictionary in her apron pocket. The library in Willowbrook had exactly one old and water-stained donated by a Lutheran pastor who died in 1932. Miriam checked it out and told Mrs. Henderson at the circulation desk she was studying for a correspondence course, which was a transparent lie since everyone knew she'd stopped school when her mother died. But she needed to understand, needed to know what they were saying when they spoke to each other in those quick, guttural exchanges that sounded nothing like English. One afternoon in mid-June, she brought lunch and stayed long enough to point at the POWs. "Plow," she said clearly. Fritz looked up from where he was adjusting the harness. His face registered surprise, then something that might have been gratitude or hope or both. "Flug," he said, then carefully enunciating each letter, P-L-O-W, plow. She pointed at the wheat rippling in the breeze. "Wheat. Weizen. Wheat. Rain. Regen. Rain." The other three had stopped working, were watching this strange lesson with fascination. Miriam felt heat rise to her face, suddenly self-conscious, but she pointed at the sky anyway. "Sky. Himmel. Sky." Fritz's accent transformed the words into something both foreign and familiar. He pointed at the earth beneath their feet. "Erde," he said, then looked at her questioningly. "Earth. Ground. Soil." He repeated each word, his mouth working around the unfamiliar sounds. Then he pointed at himself. "Freund," he said quietly, then meeting her eyes, "Friend." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, with possibility, with danger. Friend, that's what he was asking, if they could use that word, if he could cross that line. Miriam didn't answer, just picked up the empty lunch basket and walked back toward the house, her heart beating too fast. Her hands trembling slightly, but she didn't say no. And somehow Fritz seemed to understand that silence was its own kind of answer. That night, Cornelius sat in his chair by the window pipe. Smoke curling up toward the ceiling. Miriam was darning socks, though she'd been working on the same sock for half an hour without making any real progress. "You're teaching him English," Cornelius said. It wasn't a question. "Just a few words makes the work go easier if he understands what we need. That why you're doing it." Miriam set down the sock, looked at her father, really looked at him. He seemed older than he had 6 weeks ago. More tired, but also somehow less haunted, like some of the weight he'd been carrying had shifted. "I don't know why I'm doing it," she admitted quietly. Cornelius drew on his pipe, exhaled slowly. The smoke caught the lamplight and drifted. "You hate them because you don't know them yet," he said. "Once you know someone, it gets harder to keep hating. That's why wars make us call them the enemy, why they put them in uniforms and show us pictures that make them look like monsters. Because if we saw them as men, as people with families and lives and hopes, we couldn't kill them. Couldn't send our boys to kill them. Nate's dead because of them. Nate's dead because of a war that turned boys into soldiers and soldiers into killers. German boys didn't start that war any more than American boys did. Old men in offices started it. Young men died for it." Miriam picked up the sock again, stared at it without seeing it. "How can you say that after everything they took from us?" Cornelius was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was soft, measured, like he'd been thinking about this for weeks and had finally found the words. "Because hating them won't bring him back, Miri. Won't bring your mother back. Won't change a damn thing except make the world a little bit darker. And I'm tired. Tired of darkness. Tired of carrying this weight. If I can't get my son back, at least I can try not to lose what's left of my soul." Miriam didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed with her father's words echoing in her mind. Once you know someone, it gets harder to keep hating. Was that what was happening? Was she getting to know them? Was that why she found herself noticing things the way Fritz was always patient with Klaus? The way he never took more than his share of food? The way his hands moved with sureness and skill when he fixed broken equipment? The way he touched his pocket every morning and every night, like checking to make sure his most precious possession was still there? She didn't want to know him. Knowing made everything complicated, made the lines blur, made it harder to hold on to the clean, simple hatred that had sustained her through 2 years of grief. But the knowing was happening anyway, like water wearing down stone, slow, inevitable, impossible to stop. July burned hot across Iowa. The work intensified. Haying season came, and even with 4 extra hands, they were barely keeping up. All of them, Cornelius, Miriam, the 4 Germans, worked from before dawn until well past dusk, gathering hay loading wagons, storing it in the barn loft for winter. 3 months had passed since the Germans arrived. 3 months of daily work, shared meals, careful conversations in broken English and hesitant German. The sharp edges of their foreignness had worn down. They were still prisoners, still the enemy in official terms, but they were also becoming familiar. Known. Miriam had started bringing extra food at lunch. Not much, just a little more bread than strictly necessary, an extra apple or 2. She told herself it was practical. They were working harder as the weather warmed, burning more energy, needing more fuel. But when Fritz looked at the basket one afternoon and then at her, she knew he understood it was more than practicality. "This is too much," he said quietly. "Your family needs this food. Rationing is still—" "You're doing the work of 2 men each," Miriam interrupted. "You need to eat. We are prisoners. We are not entitled to— Just take it." Their eyes met, held, and in that moment something shifted between them. Some invisible boundary crossed. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She wasn't just the farmer's daughter. They were 2 people trying to navigate an impossible situation with what little grace they could manage. Fritz took the basket, set it down carefully for the others to share. "Thank you," he said, then softer, hesitant. "Nate, that was his name, your brother." Miriam felt her throat tighten, felt tears burn behind her eyes. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Tell me one thing about him," Fritz said gently. "Just one thing, please. I want to understand what was lost." She shouldn't. Every instinct screamed not to. Don't humanize yourself to the enemy. Don't share your grief with the people who caused it. Don't let them see your pain. But her mouth opened anyway. "He was scared of thunderstorms," she said. The words came out rough, uneven, even when he was grown, 21 years old and still scared of thunder. "Every time it would storm, he'd come sit in the kitchen with me until it passed." Said the noise reminded him of being small, of feeling helpless. Fritz closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for telling me, for trusting me with that." He turned away before she could respond, went back to work with a kind of fierce intensity, like he was trying to work off some unbearable emotion. And Miriam stood there in the field, wondering what she'd just done, wondering why it had felt less like betrayal and more like relief, like setting down a weight she'd been carrying too long. The attacks started in late July, not on the Aldridge farm, but at the Peterson place 3 miles down the road where another group of German prisoners worked. A prisoner named Dieter Schroeder, a true believer, a man who still thought Hitler would win, who saw surrender as betrayal, had begun systematically terrorizing the other prisoners who showed any friendliness toward their American hosts. Word spread through the prisoner network, whispered warnings, careful avoidance, fear. Fritz came back one evening walking strangely, favoring his left side. His face was bruised, lip split, one eye swelling shut. He tried to slip into the barn without being seen, but Miriam was on the porch and saw him limping across the yard. She stood up so fast her chair tipped over backward. "What happened?" Fritz shook his head, tried to smile, failed completely. "I fell, clumsy with the hay bales." "That's a lie." Cornelius came out of the house, took one look at Fritz's face, and his expression hardened into something dangerous. "Schroeder?" he asked. Fritz's silence was answer enough. Miriam looked between them, confused. "Who's Schroeder?" "Dieter Schroeder," Cornelius said quietly. "Nazi prisoner at the Peterson farm. Real believer. Thinks any German who treats Americans with respect is a traitor to the fatherland. Thinks Hitler's going to win any day now and they'll all be going home as conquering heroes. He turned back to Fritz. How bad? Is nothing. Just words and one push. I am fine. We'll heal. What kind of words? Fritz's jaw tightened. His good eye met Cornelius's steadily. He says I forget who I am, that I am too friendly with enemy, that when Germany wins people like me will be punished for collaboration, that traitors hang. Germany's not going to win. I know this, you know this, Schroeder does not accept this. He'll do it again. Probably. The two men looked at each other. Some understanding passing between them that Miriam couldn't quite read. Finally, Cornelius nodded. You tell your camp guards, no, will only make worse for me. Better to accept, to endure. Cornelius swore quietly, turned to go back inside, then stopped. You're under my roof, he said. Well, my barn. Anyone hurts you, they answer to me. You tell Schroeder that. Fritz's eyes widened slightly. Mr. Aldridge, I cannot ask you to. You're not asking. I'm telling. Cornelius went inside, left Fritz standing there in the yard looking stunned. Miriam stepped off the porch, walked toward him slowly. Come inside, she said. Miss Aldridge, I should not. Come inside. I have medicine for that. You don't need to do this. I know I don't need to. I'm choosing to. There's a difference. She led him to the porch, made him sit on the steps, went into the house and gathered what she needed. The tin of salve her mother had used for burns and cuts, clean bandages, a bowl of water, a cloth. When she came back out, Fritz was still sitting there looking uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to stay or if he should flee to the safety of the barn. Sit still, she said. She dipped the cloth in water and began cleaning the blood from his split lip. His face was tense, jaw clenched against the pain. She worked as gently as she could, but there was no way to do this without hurting him. Why do you stay friendly? She asked quietly. If it gets you beaten, why not just keep to yourself? Keep your head down. Fritz was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, raw. Because kindness is a rare thing now. In war, everything becomes hard, sharp, cruel. Everyone becomes weapon or target. When someone shows kindness, even small kindness, it reminds us we are still human, still capable of being more than what war makes us. He looked up at her. His good eye, the one that wasn't swollen shut, met hers. You and your father, you don't have to be kind to us. We are prisoners, enemy soldiers. But you are kind anyway. You teach me English words, you bring extra food, you see us as men, not as monsters. That matters more than you know, more than I can say. Miriam's hands stilled. She was close enough to see every detail of his face. The scar above his eyebrow, the lines around his eyes, the gray starting at his temples, close enough to see that he wasn't a monster. Wasn't even really the enemy anymore. He was just a man, far from home, beaten for the crime of being decent, carrying some grief so heavy it made him touch his pocket like a prayer. For the work, she said, though they both knew it was a lie now. We need you able to work. But her hands were gentle as she applied the salve to his wounds, and when their eyes met again, something passed between them. Some silent acknowledgement that they'd crossed a threshold, that whatever this was, it was no longer simple, no longer clear, and that terrified her more than anything else. September came with cooler air and changing leaves. The harvest began in earnest, all hands working from before dawn until the light failed completely. Miriam worked alongside them now, gathering wheat-loading wagons. Her muscles screaming, her hands blistered raw. She'd started knitting late at night, by lamplight, while her father dozed in his chair. A scarf, dark blue wool she'd traded eggs for at the general store. She told herself it was for Cornelius, for her father who needed a new scarf. But it wasn't the right size for Cornelius, and she'd been working on it for 5 weeks now, unraveling sections that weren't perfect, re-knitting them with painstaking care. Spending far too much time on something that was supposedly just practical. She didn't let herself think too hard about who it was really for. One evening in late September, she was in the barn loft forking hay down to where Fritz and Werner were loading the wagon below. The work was hot and dusty. Chaff stuck to her skin made her sneeze got in her hair. She paused to wipe her face with her sleeve, looked down through the gap in the floorboards. Fritz and Werner were talking in German. Their voices were low, but the barn had strange acoustics that carried sound upward. Miriam couldn't understand most of the words, but she caught a few. Familiar words she'd learned from the dictionary. Familie, family, Kinder, children, angst, fear. Werner's voice rose slightly, asking a question. Fritz responded, and even without understanding the language, Miriam could hear the pain in his answer. The grief, the uncertainty. Then Fritz's hand went to his pocket, that gesture she'd seen 100 times now, and he said something else, 2 words that she did understand, because they were names. Greta, Lisa, Emma, his wife, his daughters. Werner put a hand on Fritz's shoulder, said something that sounded like comfort. Fritz nodded, but his eyes were distant, lost. Miriam backed away from the gap in the floorboards. Felt like she'd intruded on something deeply private, but now she knew what he carried in that pocket, knew who he touched every morning and every night like a talisman, a photograph of his family, wife and daughters he hadn't seen in years, might never see again. And suddenly the full weight of it hit her. Fritz wasn't just a German soldier. He was a father, a husband, a man with a family waiting somewhere across an ocean. A family who might be dead, who might be starving, who might think he was dead. And here he was safe and fed in Iowa while his wife and children faced God knew what horrors. The guilt must be crushing. The not knowing must be worse than death. Miriam climbed down the ladder with trembling hands, went back to the house. Sat at the kitchen table in the gathering dark and cried for the first time since her mother's funeral. Cried for Nate, for her mother, for her father who'd lost everything, but also impossibly for Fritz, for Greta and Lisa and Emma who might be dead, for all the families torn apart by this terrible war. Cried until she had no tears left. November arrived with the first hard frost. The last of the harvest was in. The fields lay bare waiting for winter. The work slowed. There was still plenty to do, equipment to repair fences, to mend animals, to tend. But the desperate urgency of summer and fall had eased. On a cold Sunday morning, Dorothea Whitmore came to visit. She arrived bearing a cake, German chocolate cake, which was either a terrible joke or a deliberate kindness. With Dottie, you could never be quite sure which. She set it on the kitchen table and looked out the window at where the 4 Germans were repairing fence posts in the south pasture. "How are they working out?" she asked. "Fine," Miriam said carefully. "They work hard, no complaints." "I imagine they do. Poor souls have nothing else to occupy their time." Miriam blinked. Poor souls. These were German soldiers, the enemy. Dottie seemed to read her thoughts. She sat down at the table, folded her gnarled hands in front of her. "My husband died in the First War," she said quietly. "Argonne Forest, 1918. He was 22 years old. German machine gun got him. Cut him down like wheat. I hated them for it. Hated every German person who'd ever lived or ever would live. Thought I'd hate them until the day I died." She paused, smoothed the tablecloth with fingers bent by arthritis. "Then in 1925 I met a woman in Des Moines, German immigrant. Came over in 1920 after the war. She'd lost her brother in the Argonne too. Different side of the same battle. Maybe her brother was even the one who shot my Thomas. I'll never know." Dottie looked up at Miriam. "We cried together. 2 women who'd never met speaking different languages, crying over boys who'd killed each other because men in offices told them to. And I realized something that day. War makes enemies out of people who should have been friends. Makes us hate people we'd have loved in different circumstances. And peace, real peace, means having the courage to look across that divide and choose differently." After Dottie left, Miriam stood at the counter looking at the German chocolate cake. She cut it into 5 pieces, kept one for herself and Cornelius, put 4 pieces on a plate. That evening, when the Germans had finished their work and were heading toward the barn, she intercepted them. Mrs. Whitmore made this, she said, holding out the plate. She wanted you to have some. Fritz took the plate carefully like it might shatter if he breathed wrong. Please thank her for us, he said. This is very kind. Klaus's eyes were fixed on the cake like it was treasure, like he hadn't seen anything sweet in years, which Miriam realized he probably hadn't. She was turning to leave when Fritz spoke again. Your brother, Nate, what was he like? The question hit her like a slap. She spun around, anger flaring hot and immediate. You don't get to ask that. You don't deserve to know anything about him. Fritz didn't flinch, just stood there holding the plate of cake, his face grave and serious. You are right, he said quietly. I don't deserve, but I ask anyway, because maybe if I know who he was, I can understand better what was lost, what we all lost, not just you, all of us, every family, every mother and father and sister. Maybe if I understand, I can honor that loss properly. Miriam's voice cracked. You didn't lose anything, you people took. That's all you do, take and destroy and... She couldn't finish. The words choked off in her throat. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to shed in front of them. She turned and ran back to the house, locked herself in her room. Lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to breathe through the tightness in her chest. Because Fritz was right, even though she hated that he was right. He didn't deserve to know about Nate. But he'd asked anyway, had wanted to understand, had wanted to bear witness to a life cut short, and nobody else had done that. Not the neighbors with their casseroles and hollow condolences, not the government with their telegrams and medals. Nobody had asked what Nate was really like, who he'd been when he wasn't wearing a uniform. Only the enemy had asked that question. Only Fritz had cared enough to want to know. The next morning, Miriam made extra lunch without thinking about it. Bread, cheese, apples, and this time cold chicken left over from Sunday dinner. More food than the 4 Germans needed. More than was strictly practical or necessary. When she brought it to the field, Fritz looked at the basket and then at her face. This is too much, he said gently. Miss Aldridge, your family... He liked to draw, Miriam interrupted. Fritz went still. Nate, my brother, he liked to draw, had sketchbooks full of pictures, birds mostly. He could spend hours watching a cardinal or a blue jay, sketching it from different angles. Said he liked how they could fly away when things got bad. Wished he could do that, just fly away. Her voice broke on the last words. Fritz set down the basket very carefully. He sounds like a beautiful person. Creative, sensitive. The world needed more people like him. The world killed him instead. Yes. Fritz's voice was thick with grief. The world killed many good people. My brother, too. Stefan. He was 19, died at Stalingrad, froze to death in a trench alone and afraid and far from home. He played violin, was so talented, could make you cry with his music. Now there is no more music, just silence. They stood there in the field, 2 people on opposite sides of a finished war, connected by grief and loss and the terrible understanding that both had paid too high a price. I'm sorry about Stefan, Miriam said finally. I'm sorry about Nate. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, a first step toward acknowledging each other's humanity, each other's pain. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Christmas came to Willowbrook wrapped in snow and silence. The church held a special service on Christmas Eve. Reverend Morrison preached about peace on earth and goodwill toward all men. About forgiveness being harder than hatred but infinitely more important. About the long road ahead now that the war was finally truly over. Most of the town came, even Luther Brennan, though he sat in the back with his arms crossed and his face set in hard, bitter lines. And in the very last pew, sitting alone with his cap in his hands and his head bowed, was Fritz Hartmann. Miriam saw him when she and Cornelius arrived, saw him sitting there like a man in confession, like a man seeking absolution he didn't think he deserved. After the service, people filed out into the cold December night. Fritz waited until everyone else had left, then slipped toward the side door, trying to avoid the crowd. Miriam caught up to him outside, her breath making clouds in the freezing air. Fritz, wait. He turned surprise clear on his face. She held out a package wrapped in brown paper and string. Her hands shook slightly as she offered it to him. "Merry Christmas," she said. Fritz stared at the package like he didn't know what to do with it. His eyes were suddenly bright with tears. "I cannot. Why would you? Just open it." He unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside was the scarf, dark blue wool, perfectly knit, every stitch even. She'd finished it 2 nights ago and stayed up until 3 in the morning, making sure it was perfect. Fritz held it up, ran the wool through his fingers. "You made this," he whispered. "You made this for me. It's cold. You need something warm for the fields." "Why?" His voice broke. "Your brother. I could be the one who... Why would you make this for me?" "Because you're not what they told me you'd be. They said you'd be monsters, cruel, inhuman, evil, but you're not. You're just men, you're just people trying to survive, same as us, and I'm tired, Fritz. So tired of hating, so tired of being angry all the time. It doesn't bring Nate back, doesn't bring my mother back, doesn't fix anything, just makes everything hurt more." Fritz was crying now, not trying to hide it. Tears ran down his face and froze in the December air. "I have something," he said. His voice was barely audible. "Something I must show you, something I carry every day. I think maybe you should have it, or maybe I should keep it. I don't know. But you should see." His hands were shaking so badly he could barely reach into his jacket pocket, but he managed it. Drew out that piece of paper he touched every morning and every night, the one Miriam had wondered about for 7 months. He unfolded it with infinite care, hands trembling, breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then he held it out to her. It was a photograph, old, creased from being folded and unfolded countless times, worn at the edges, and Miriam's whole world stopped, because she knew this photograph, had seen it 1,000 times. It had sat on the mantelpiece in their parlor until her mother died, and then Cornelius had put it away because it hurt too much to look at. The Aldridge family. 1938. Cornelius and Mary. Miriam at 11. And Nate at 14, wearing his first suit jacket, grinning that crooked grin that made everyone love him. "Where did you get this?" The words came out as barely a whisper. Fritz's face was anguished, destroyed. "Normandy, June 7th, 1944. Day after the invasion. My unit, we are in bunker on the beach. Americans attack. There is terrible fighting, so much blood, so much death. I am firing, trying to stay alive, trying to keep my men alive, and then there is soldier, American soldier, running toward our position. I shoot, he falls." Fritz's voice broke completely. He had to stop, gather himself, force the words out. "After, when fighting moves inland, I go to check the dead, to take papers for identification for command. And I find him. The soldier I shot, he is dead, and in his pocket I find this photograph. This family, and I see his face in the picture, so young, so happy, and I realize what I have done. I have killed someone's son, someone's brother, have taken him from people who love him." Miriam couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world had narrowed to this photograph, this impossible, terrible truth. "I don't know if he is your brother. Normandy, thousands of men died. Many soldiers had this insignia. But when I see photograph in your house, when I recognize uniform, I think, maybe, probably. And I am sick with guilt because I am living in his home, being fed by his family, and I killed him." He tried to fold the photograph to hand it back to her. "You should have this, should have piece of him back. I have carried him for 18 months, carried his face as reminder, as penance. Every day I look at him and remember that war is not glory, is not honor, is just young men killing other young men who should have been friends." Miriam stared at the photograph, at her family, at Nate's face, forever frozen at 14, forever smiling. And she understood now, understood why Fritz screamed in his sleep, why he touched his pocket like a prayer, why he'd turned pale when he saw the photograph in their parlor. Why he'd asked about Nate, wanting to know who he was. Because Fritz had been carrying her brother's ghost for 1.5 years, had been carrying the weight of that death every single day, had kept this photograph as both memorial and torment. You kept it, she said. Her voice sounded strange, distant. For 18 months, you carried my brother with you. I am so sorry, so sorry. If I could undo it, if I could bring him back. Stop! Miriam's voice cracked completely. She was crying now, couldn't stop. 18 months of grief and rage and loneliness pouring out of her in great gasping sobs. You can't bring him back. Nobody can. He's gone and he's never coming back, and it doesn't matter who pulled the trigger, doesn't matter which bullet. He's still dead, still gone, still never coming home. Fritz stood there, tears streaming down his face, holding the photograph and the scarf, looking like a man condemned, waiting for judgment, waiting for her to scream at him, to hit him, to tell her father, to demand he be sent away and punished. And Miriam realized she had a choice. She could hate him, could let this knowledge destroy everything, could tell Cornelius, tell the town, demand Fritz be transferred to a harsher camp, demand justice or revenge or whatever hollow satisfaction came from making him suffer. Or she could do what Reverend Morrison had preached about, what her father had tried to show her, what Dottie Whitmore had learned 70 years too late. She could choose mercy over hatred. Keep it, she said finally, softly. Keep the photograph and the scarf, and remember that people can be better than what war makes them, that your enemy's sister can look at you and see a person, not a monster, that forgiveness is possible even when it seems impossible. Fritz made a sound that might have been a sob or a prayer or both. He clutched the scarf to his chest. I will never forget this, he whispered. Never. You give me something I don't deserve, something I cannot repay. You saved me. You don't have to repay it. That's what kindness is. It's not a transaction, it's just choosing to be human, choosing to see the human in someone else even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. They stood there in the snow outside the church. Two people on opposite sides of a finished war. Connected by a crooked-smiled boy who died too young, by grief and guilt and the fragile possibility of peace. And for the first time since Nate died, since her mother's heart gave out, since the world fell apart, Miriam felt something other than rage and pain. She felt the faint trembling beginning of healing. 3 days after Christmas, a truck arrived from the depot. A Red Cross worker climbed out carrying a canvas sack of mail for the prisoners. Hartmann, he called. Friedrich Hartmann. Fritz stepped forward, his face pale. His hands shook as he took the envelope with his name written in unfamiliar feminine handwriting. He stood there in the cold yard staring at it, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might say. Finally, Miriam said gently, "Open it, Fritz." He tore it open with trembling fingers, drew out thin paper covered in German script. His eyes moved over the words once, twice, and then his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the frozen ground, the letter clutched in his hands, and wept. Great gasping sobs that shook his whole body like earthquake tremors. Miriam ran to him, dropped to her knees beside him in the snow. "Fritz, Fritz, what is it? What's wrong?" He couldn't speak, could only hand her the letter with shaking hands. It was in German, but she recognized some words now. Greta, Kinder, München, Leben, alive. They were alive. "Oh," Miriam breathed. "Oh, Fritz." She put her arms around him, held him while he cried, held a man who'd killed her brother and carried his photograph as penance, a man who'd been beaten for kindness, a man who'd spent 2 years not knowing if his family was alive or dead. And she was glad, genuinely, truly glad that his story wouldn't end in the same tragedy as hers. Because she'd learned something over these 7 months. Something that changed everything. The enemy was just another word for stranger. And once you knew someone really knew them, they stopped being the enemy. They became human, complicated, real. They became against all odds and reasons something like a friend. 3 days later, Cornelius called Fritz into the house. Fritz came hesitantly, cap in his hands, unsure what this meant. Cornelius gestured to the chair by the fireplace. "Sit." Fritz sat. Cornelius reached into his desk drawer, drew out a letter. Not old, the paper was fresh, the creases sharp. Official letterhead visible at the top. He held it out to Fritz. This came 2 weeks ago, Cornelius said quietly. From the Red Cross in Geneva, confirming they'd located your family, that the letter you received was on its way to you. Fritz stared at the paper, at the Red Cross seal, at the date December 10th, 1945. But I received my letter December 27th, he said slowly, his accent thickening with confusion. You know before me? Cornelius nodded. His face was grave, lined with emotion. I wrote to them in October, asked them to search for Greta Hartmann and 2 children in the Munich area, told them you were here working my farm, that you deserved to know if your family lived or died. Fritz's hands started shaking violently. The paper rattled. You helped me 2 months before I know anything. You saved my cattle that night in July. Worked yourself near to death looking for them when they got loose. Could have let them go. Could have done the minimum. But you didn't. You worked like they were your own animals. Like this was your farm. Your responsibility. Cornelius's voice thickened with emotion. And I realized you weren't my enemy anymore. Maybe you never really were. You were just a man far from home, scared. Same as my boy was scared in France, and I thought, I can't bring Nate back, but maybe I can help bring you back to your family. Could do that one small thing. Fritz stood abruptly. The letters, both of them, fell from his hands. He crossed the room in 3 strides and embraced Cornelius, hard, desperate, like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. You kill me with kindness, Fritz whispered in broken English, his voice muffled against Cornelius's shoulder. You give me back my life, my family, my hope, my reason to live, and I kill your son. I am the one who... War killed my son, Cornelius said firmly, his own voice rough with tears. You just happened to be there, just happened to be the one holding the rifle. Could have been any soldier, any bullet. Doesn't change what happened, doesn't bring him back. He held Fritz tighter. But peace is giving me a chance to save someone else's son, to send you home to daughters who need their father, to a wife who's been waiting. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Nate would have wanted. For me to choose kindness over revenge, life over death, hope over hatred. They stood there in the warm kitchen while snow fell outside. 2 men who should have been enemies, who were enemies by every definition of war and nation and flag, but who had chosen somehow to become something else, something better, something that looked impossibly like family. February brought news that changed everything. The repatriation orders arrived on a gray morning when frost still clung to the windows. The military truck would come in 3 days. All German prisoners in Willowbrook County would be transported to the depot, processed and sent home. Home. To a Germany that existed only in ruins now, to cities bombed to rubble, to a future that promised nothing but hardship and the long work of rebuilding from ashes. Fritz received the news standing in the barn, holding the official paper with hands that trembled. Werner, Helmut, and Klaus gathered around him, reading over his shoulder. Their faces showed relief and fear in equal measure. They were going home. But to what? To whom Miriam was kneading bread dough when Cornelius told her. Her hands stilled. All of them. 3 days. She wanted to feel relief. Instead, she felt loss, sharp and unexpected, like something was being torn away before she was ready. That evening, Cornelius did something he'd never done before. He invited all 4 Germans into the house for dinner. They came hesitantly, tracking snow despite trying to wipe their boots carefully. Miriam had made stew beef and potatoes and carrots. Had set the table with her mother's good plates. They ate mostly in silence. The clink of spoons, the creak of chairs, men trying to memorize a moment they'd need to remember later. After dinner, Cornelius brought out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving since 1938. Poured 5 glasses. To survival, he said. To getting home. To whatever comes next. They drank to that. Then Cornelius walked to a cabinet in the corner, drew out a wooden box, set it on the table in front of Fritz, and opened it. Inside were tools, wood chisels, carving knives, planes and files. Beautiful old tools, their handles worn smooth from decades of use. "These were my father's," Cornelius said quietly. "He was a furniture maker, taught me the trade, but I chose farming. These have been sitting unused for 40 years. He pushed the box toward Fritz. "You said your father was a carpenter. You said his workshop burned. Maybe when you get home, when you start rebuilding, you'll need tools. Maybe you can make something good, something that lasts." Fritz stared at the tools like they were made of gold. "I cannot take your father's. My father would want them used," Cornelius said firmly. "Would want them in hands that'll build instead of destroy." Fritz stood and embraced Cornelius. No words, just two men who'd been enemies and became brothers. The morning they left was bitterly cold. Miriam had wrapped food for their journey. Bread, cheese, apples. She pressed the packages into their hands as they climbed into the truck. Fritz was last. He stood in the yard holding the box of tools. The dark blue scarf was wrapped around his neck. And in his pocket, Miriam knew, was the photograph of her family, of Nate. "I will write," he said. "If I can. If letters get through, I will tell you I'm safe, that I found them. I'd like that." He set down the tools and pressed something into her hand, a piece of paper folded small. "Read this later, when I'm gone." He climbed into the truck, the scarf bright blue against the gray canvas. Dorothea Whitmore had come to see them off. A few other townspeople gathered too. Even Luther Brennan stood apart, raising one hand in a brief, awkward wave. Fritz looked back through the open truck. His eyes found Miriam's. He touched his hand to the scarf, to his heart, to the pocket where he kept the photograph. Then the truck turned the corner and they were gone. Inside, Miriam unfolded Fritz's note. Careful English, each word chosen with effort. "Dear Miriam, my English is not good for say what I feel, but I try. You give me scarf when I deserve nothing. You give me kindness when I deserve hate. You teach me that war does not decide who we are. We decide. I killed your brother. This I know. This I carry always, but you teach me that carrying guilt is not enough. Must also carry hope. Must choose to build, not just to mourn. I keep photograph to remember Nate. To remember that every soldier is someone's son, someone loved. But also I keep it to remember you. To remember that his sister was brave enough to see me as human. That she chose kindness when kindness seemed impossible. This changes my life. This changes everything. Thank you. Always thank you. Your friend Fritz." 3 months later, the first letter arrived from Germany. "Dear Miriam and Mr. Aldridge, I arrived in Munich. The city is destroyed more than I can describe. Buildings are only shells, people look like ghosts. But I found Greta and my daughters. They are thin, so thin but alive. Emma didn't remember me at first. She was 3 when I left. Now she's 9. I am stranger to her, but Lisa remembered. She cried and held me. We have nothing, no house, no work, but we have each other, and I have tools Mr. Aldridge gave me. Already I make small things. A table, a chair. People need furniture. They pay with food. We will survive. I keep photograph. I keep scarf. I wear scarf every day. These give me strength. Your friend always, Fritz." The letters came 2 or 3 times a year over the following decade. 1947, Greta is pregnant. We will have 3rd daughter. 1950, business grows. We make beds and tables. Each piece I make, I remember Mr. Aldridge's gift. Miriam's letters changed too. She wrote about finishing school, about teaching, about meeting Thomas, a quiet librarian who'd been 4F during the war, about marrying him in 1952. She wrote about her daughter Mary in 1953, and then in 1955 about her son. "Dear Fritz, we had a boy, born last Tuesday. We named him Nathaniel, after my brother. I hope this doesn't hurt you to know. By naming my son Nathaniel, I'm honoring my brother's memory. Saying his name continues. He mattered, and I think you understand that better than anyone. Because you kept his picture. You made sure he wasn't just another nameless casualty. Thank you for that, for remembering him. Your friend Miriam Fritz's response came 3 months later. Water stains suggested tears had fallen while he wrote. Dear Miriam, I cried when I read your letter. You name your son after brother I killed, and you tell me this is honor, not accusation. This breaks my heart and heals it. Every year on June 7th, I go to church. I light candle. I pray for all men who died at Normandy, but especially I pray for your brother. Now there is new Nathaniel in world. This is good. This is right. This is how we defeat death, not by forgetting, but by remembering and still choosing life. I want to come back to Iowa someday. Want to see farm again. Want to thank you properly. I am saving money. One day I will come. With love, Fritz. In September 1958, a different letter arrived. Dear Miriam, I am coming to America. I saved for 6 years, enough for passage for all of us. We come in October. I must see the farm again, must introduce my family to people who saved me. Can we visit your friend Fritz? Miriam wrote back the same day, yes, come home. October 17th, 1958. The train platform in Willowbrook. Miriam stood with Thomas holding 5-year-old Mary's hand. Little Nathaniel rode on Thomas's shoulders. Cornelius leaned on his cane, old eyes fixed on the tracks. 13 years since Fritz had left. The train appeared, stopped, doors opened. Fritz stepped down, 44 now, graying heavier. But the eyes were the same, kind, grateful, alive. Behind him came Greta, small, dark-haired, kind-faced. Then 3 young women, Lisa, Emma, and 10-year-old Anna, born after the war. Fritz saw Miriam. His face broke into that grateful smile. Miriam. He embraced her like family, whispered Danke over and over. Greta took Miriam's hands, tears streaming. Thank you. You save my husband. You give him back to me. You give my children their father. He saved something in me too, Miriam said, crying. Saved me from drowning in hate. Fritz turned to Cornelius. The old farmer opened his arms and Fritz walked into them. 2 old men who'd been enemies and became brothers. The week felt suspended outside time. Fritz showed Greta everything. The barn where he'd slept, the fields he'd worked, the porch steps where Miriam had cleaned his wounds. He showed her the north field, the first field he'd plowed. Here, he said, Greta's hand in his. Here is where I learned I was still human. The children played together, Mary and Nathaniel, with Anna language meaning nothing to them. One evening, Cornelius pulled Fritz aside. Walk with me. They walked to the north field in the gathering dusk. I'm dying, Cornelius said quietly. Doctor says 6 months, maybe a year, heart's giving out. I'm sorry. Cornelius waved a hand. Don't be. I've lived long enough. Done what I needed to do. He looked at Fritz. You know what I needed to do. I needed to prove that losing my son didn't make me lose my humanity. That I could choose mercy when mercy seemed impossible. His voice was strong. You gave me that chance. You saved me as much as I saved you. Fritz's eyes filled with tears. When I'm gone, Cornelius continued, I want you to remember that forgiveness is possible, that enemies can become brothers, that love is stronger than hate if we're brave enough to choose it. They stood as the sun set, 2 old men who'd fought on opposite sides and found peace. The Hartmans left a week later. More tears, more promises to write, to visit, to never let this connection break. As the train pulled away, Fritz leaned out the window, touched the scarf, touched his heart, touched the pocket where he kept the photograph. Then the train curved and they were gone. Cornelius died on February 3rd, 1967. 84 years old, passed away in his sleep in his chair by the window. Fritz came to the funeral, flew from Germany alone, stood in the February cold and spoke the eulogy Miriam couldn't give. Cornelius Aldridge taught me that a man is defined not by who he hates, but by who he chooses to forgive. Fritz said, his voice carrying across the mourners. He lost his son to war, could have chosen bitterness, chosen revenge. Instead, he chose to see his enemies as humans deserving of dignity. His voice broke. He was my enemy. He became my savior. He showed me forgiveness when I deserved none. He taught me that the greatest victory is not in destroying your enemy, but in making him your friend. After the service, Luther Brennan approached Fritz. They hadn't spoken in 22 years. "I was wrong," Luther said quietly. "About you, about all of it. Spent 30 years being angry, and what did it get me? Nothing. Just a wasted life." Fritz looked at him with compassion. "It's never too late to choose differently. You can choose even now to let the hate go." Luther nodded, extended his hand. Fritz took it, and something in Luther's face shifted, some weight beginning to lift. The years marched on. 1998, November. The call came in the middle of the night, Emma's voice breaking with tears. "Miriam, Papa died. This morning. Peacefully. He was looking at a photograph and wearing a scarf." Miriam knew which ones. "He asked me to tell you something," Emma continued. "He said to tell you he kept the scarf, wore it every winter for 53 years. Because it reminded him that kindness is real, that people can choose to be better." 3 weeks later, a package arrived. Inside was the scarf, worn, faded, holes where wool had given way, and a letter. "Dear Miriam, Papa wanted you to have this back. He said you made it when you were 18, when you were grieving and had every reason to hate. But you made kindness instead. He told us the story many times, how you changed his life, how you taught him that enemies are just people we haven't learned to love yet. Thank you for giving us back our father. With love, Emma." Miriam held the scarf she'd made 53 years ago, could see where it had been mended, where Fritz had refused to let it fall apart. 2008. April. Miriam was 81. A reporter came to interview her for a documentary about German POWs in Iowa. "Tell me about Fritz Hartmann," the young woman said. Miriam was quiet, thinking how to compress 53 years into words. "Fritz taught me that the enemy is just another word for stranger," she said finally. "And once you know someone, really know them, they stop being the enemy." She looked at the north field through the window. "I was 18 when he came, full of hate. I thought I knew what evil looked like, thought it wore a German uniform, thought the world was simple." She touched the threadbare scarf in her lap. "But Fritz taught me that good and evil aren't about what uniform you wear. They're about the choices you make, the person you choose to be when it would be easier to be cruel." She looked at the camera. "That scarf was my choice, to be kind when everything in me wanted to be harsh, to see a person when it would have been simpler to see a monster. And that choice rippled out across decades, changed his life, changed mine, changed everything." "Do you regret it?" the reporter asked, "knowing he might have killed your brother?" Miriam smiled, sad but wise. "No, because hating Fritz wouldn't have brought Nate back, wouldn't have healed anything, would have just made the world darker, and we needed light." Her voice grew stronger. "War makes us forget we're all human, makes us think the enemy is different from us. But they're not. They're just people, scared, trying to survive, trying to get home, just like us." The interview ended. The reporter left. Miriam walked to the mantelpiece. It held a photograph from 1958, two families standing together. Miriam and Thomas with their children, Fritz and Greta with theirs, Cornelius in the center, hands on both their shoulders. All smiling. Below it in a glass case were two objects. The scarf, blue and threadbare and precious, the photograph, the Aldridge family from 1938. Creased from being carried for 54 years, Miriam touched the glass gently. "We did it," she whispered. "To Nate, to Cornelius, to Fritz, to all the lost and all the found. We chose kindness, and kindness won." Outside, the sun set over the north field, golden light across the wheat, the same light that had lit this land for generations, that would continue long after everyone who remembered the war was gone. But the story would remain, passed down, told and retold, a story about enemies who became friends, about hate that transformed into love, about one scarf and one photograph and the truth that forgiveness is always possible if we're brave enough to choose it. Miriam wrapped the threadbare scarf around her shoulders one last time, felt the weight of it, the history, the love, and she felt peace, complete and perfect, because she'd learned the secret Fritz carried for 54 years. The secret Cornelius knew all along, that in the end we're all just people trying to find our way home. And the only thing that survives, the only thing that matters, the only thing worth carrying across decades and oceans and the vast distances between enemy and friend is kindness. Just kindness. Simple and profound and powerful enough to change the world. One choice at a time, until enemies become strangers, and strangers become friends, and friends become family, and hate becomes love, and darkness becomes light, forever.